Welcome to this FAIN online event with Leila Mottley to discuss her novel Nightcrawling. Leila Mottley is a native of Oakland, California. She's performed and led poetry workshops as the 2018 Oakland Youth Poet Laureate and has been published in numerous journals and anthologies in the States, including in the New York Times. Nightcrawling is her first novel. Welcome, Leila.
Thank you for having me.
I know everyone will be so excited. This is such an incredible book. I want to start by asking you, you were just 17 when you wrote the novel, which is incredible. What was it that made you decide to sit down and write a novel at such a young age? And what was it about this particular story that compelled you to write about it?
This is actually my third novel that I've written.
Wow.
So I wrote my first novel at 14, and then my second at 15.
Wow.
And then my third, this one, I started, I think, the month before I turned 17. And then I finished it in the first few months of being 17. And I think really with this story, what made it different than those other two was that I, even after the first draft, which is always kind of bad, I read it over and I could see through all of the things that I wanted to change, that there was something about it that would have an impact in the world, and that I could do the work to get through all of the revisions that it takes to make a book good and readable, and in order to get to, the message that I knew was really important, and the characters who I had grown to love.
And the main character of the book in particular is such a compelling and real voice. She jumps off the page. As a first-time published novelist, how did you get into that voice and that character? How did you bring her to life?
I mean, I think it helps because I wrote in first person, so I had to immerse myself entirely in this character, and through doing that and writing every single day throughout the drafting process, it meant that I had to figure out everything about her life and her head and the way that she saw the world. And I do a lot of journaling when I'm writing from first person, so I would journal from Kiara's perspective to try to get into like her daily life, because I think it's really important that we know a character inside and out in order for the reader to feel like they are inside of Kiara's head. So I worked really hard to make sure that I didn't leave her and that I could understand her in a way that would allow us to exist with her and not feel like we're watching her.
Yeah, absolutely. And this case, the story, of course, is loosely inspired by a real case. And the book, without spoiling anything, doesn't have a fairy tale ending, let's say, and nor did the real life case. So the police officers who were involved in this sexual exploitation case, many of them didn't really face any repercussions, many of them kept their jobs. What do you feel was important to explore in terms of what this case said about race and justice in America?
I mean, I grew up in Oakland. I was born and raised in Oakland. I still live in Oakland. And in the Bay Area in 2016, this case broke where a young girl was sexually abused by many different Bay Area police officers. And there were attempts to cover it up, but eventually this came out, and there was a lot of turmoil that followed. It kind of consumed our local media. It didn't make it much further than that. And I remember watching as like a young teenager, 13 or 14, and just feeling like, wow, this is really a representation of what I already know to be true about the ways in which this world does not protect young girls. And so I started to like think about this, but also pay a lot of attention to the way the media talked about it, and this focus on the police officers and the relationship between the police department and the community, instead of like, what is the impact on this young girl, and what does that impact say about what is happening to so many girls and women that we never hear about. So I started to think about that, and then I researched a lot of other cases of police sexual violence, very few of which are ever, in the media in a large way, and very, very few of which ever have actual repercussions. And so I knew from the beginning that I didn't want to paint this like false portrait of a utopia that we don't live in. And so I knew from the beginning that it wasn't going to end like that, that I didn't want to find justice in a system that has never provided it. But at the same time, like, I really think that what's so important about this case, about the story that I created, this like different branch of a girl's world, is that we experience it as a very personal issue, that it's not a theory, it is a very it's something that we can feel, the repercussions of which we feel reverberate through Kiara's life, and by witnessing that, by experiencing it through reading this book, I hope that more of us are able to remove the distance between ourselves and what we often think of as like political issues.
Yeah. And one of those issues that you talk about a little bit in the acknowledgements of the book as well, and that runs through the novel, is this idea of the kind of adultification of black girls. And Kiara says at one point in the book that she sometimes feels trapped between roles of being a child and being a mother. Can you say a little bit about that and about why you wanted to kind of shine a spotlight on that particularly?
Yeah, I think that we often don't acknowledge the truth of the things that we put on black girls, and the ways that then it affects us as black women as we grow up. And I think that a lot of it is because we don't even question it. We don't even pause to question it. But black girls experience, many of us, this caregiving role that is placed on us from such a young age, that we don't pause to wonder if we could not have to take on this role. And because the world both hypersexualizes black girls and demeans us at the same time, it creates this strange limbo where particularly black teenage girls are not allowed to be children, but also aren't allowed or given the respect that we associate with adulthood. So I think that it creates this confusing limbo where black women and black girls remain invisible, and yet at the same time, so much of the weight of the world is put on us.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring that across so beautifully in the novel. It's so clear and it's so kind of painful to watch. And of course, this has been for you a kind of complete explosion of interest. Your book was sold at an extremely competitive auction. You're here in the UK as part of a whirlwind tour. You know, internationally it's been chosen as an Oprah's book club pick. You've spoken in previous interviews about kind of navigating the unwritten rules of the publishing industry. How has that experience felt for you? How's it been?
It's been such a learning experience. I really knew nothing about publishing a book before I was in the middle of it. And I think that it has been just like it's been a fast whirlwind where I have had to learn a lot really quickly, and kind of get my footing, even amidst things that I can't even grasp, I can't grasp the numbers of people reading this book. I can't grasp Oprah and the book club pick, and even this tour. I'm about halfway through with it, and I'm still processing what happened last week. But I think that that's kind of what it makes it so amazing, is I don't really need to be able to understand its impact, as long as I know that there's at least one reader out there who is finding something in this book.
Have you noticed that there's been any sort of differences in the response to the book in the US and the UK?
That's so interesting. Both responses have been amazing, just an absolute explosion. I think that it's been interesting to hear reflected back to me the ways in which the UK, people from the UK experience this kind of look into American policing. But I also think it's been interesting because I know that there was this case of UK police sexual violence recently. And so hearing people reflect on that in their own cultural context is also really, I think it really emphasizes the interconnectedness of it all, that, even though the systems of policing are not the same things tend to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And the inherent power imbalance and the institutional racism and misogyny.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that we're struggling with here in the the UK at the moment is we have these recent cases of Sarah Everard and also of two black women called Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman, who after they were murdered, their bodies were photographed and the photographs shared by a police officer with lots of colleagues in a WhatsApp group. And one of the things that we've been struggling with, I think, in the UK is trying to get people to recognise this as a systemic issue rather than as isolated incidents. Right. Do you think that fiction can play an important role in helping people come to that understanding of these institutional problems?
I mean, I think it depends on how you read a book. It can, but it can also not. I think that as readers, we enter in with either a willingness to read into the book, to allow it to be internalized, or we don't. And I think that with Nightcrawling, I wanted to make sure that this book could be read as like a good story first, that we could love these characters first, because I think that is actually what real change from fiction, where it comes from, is this love, this investment in someone's life, even if it is very different from our own. And I think that investment doesn't allow us to do the same kind of distancing that I think we often do.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I've read that you like to think about your book either acting as a mirror or a window for different readers. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've read books as both, and I think both are really special experiences, but either reading a book and having it like reflect you back to you is like so special. It's profound. And at the same time, I think some of us read books and we're like, this is entirely outside of my world, and it expands my idea of our world. And I think that is also something that can be really important, and I try to make sure that like my work can do both, and that I like always, you know, appreciate both sides of a reading experience, because I think they both matter, and I think both are reflections of the ways in which stories impact our lives.
Absolutely. And this story, of course, has impact in so many different axes at the same time. It is a book that looks at issues of inequality around race, but also around class. And I've seen a few reviews that say that this is a book about race and class, and it doesn't kind of say anything explicit about gender, which I thought was kind of mind-blowing, considering how much the book does very subtly, of course, talk about gender. There's a quote when Kiara talks about the police officers who abuse her, and she says, "They want me to feel small so they can feel big." And there are so many characters in the novel, I think, who are grappling with gender and its impact on them. Of course, not least, there's the context of sex work and of trafficking. Can you say a bit about what you wanted to explore with regards to gender and gender inequality as well?
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting that we often don't notice that, and I think it's because the characters aren't necessarily acknowledging it in plain terms either. But at the same time, like it's woven through the whole book. Every interaction is kind of laced with the impact of the ways in which their experiences are gendered. And Kiara in particular, in contrast to her brother Marcus, we see the ways in which these two people raised in the same family are given entirely different parameters of how to exist and how to navigate the world. And I wanted to create that contrast as like the most central example of gender and gender politics within this book, because I think that it's really interesting for us to be able to watch these two people who we can love, both of them, and also recognize how, you know, Kiara has been put in a role in which she is assumed to be the caregiver, and Marcus has been put in a role in which he believes that his only value is through the things that he might do. And those two things are complicated in their own right, and at the same time we see like how they impact each other and the interpersonal relationship. And I think for me, I think one of the most important parts of like looking at gender is looking at the ways that it changes how we interact with each other. And especially like within a family context, I think it's a really important thing that we recognize, because I think a lot of our families function in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're so right that the character's own kind of refusal to acknowledge that is perhaps partly why people haven't picked up on it so much. And there's also a really painful scene in the book. You don't shy away from really difficult, painful. It's a very unflinching book. Was that difficult in the writing?
It wasn't difficult for most of it. I think there were scenes and there were chapters that were harder to write than others. But I mean, I was writing it from Kiara's world and her perspective, and I don't think she views her world as heavy and dark and painful, or at least not completely. And I think that because I was approaching it from her perspective, it allowed me to see her and the whole entire story from that lens of like, this is just a life and this is her normalized life. And so I think that the judgment of like pain is sometimes coming from the outside and not from how we experience ourselves. And so some parts of the book were really hard to write, but I also think like that's part of it, you know, that's part of writing, is being able to write into the depths of all emotions. And she has some moments that are like full of grief that are hard for me to write, and there are also moments that are like just really nuanced that can be more difficult. But I don't know, I think it was a book in which I knew I had to approach it with just complete disregard for the like parameters and the constraints we often put on ourselves around what is appropriate and what's not. I wrote it like no one was ever going to read it, because I didn't think anyone was ever going to read it, and I think that helped me to just like make sure that this book was first and foremost her story, and at times that was hard and it was challenging.
There's a scene in the book which I've seen some reviewers describe as Kiara making a choice to have drug sex, and other reviewers describe as a rape. Have you been surprised by the response to that scene? And what did it mean to you writing that scene in terms of the conversation that we're having around consent and power and balance?
I'm not surprised at all. I think that that's kind of the point, is that it's ambiguous, and consent is not always black and white for either person in the scenario. And I think that with that particular scene, I knew that like consent also wasn't necessarily the first thing on her mind. You know, sometimes it's not the thing that we're thinking about, is like, did I say yes or no? That wasn't the point for her. And I think that in hindsight, we all have different ideas of ourselves and our interactions, but like in the present moment, this book is, you know, written in present tense, which meant that every moment Kiara was living was just the moment she was living it, which meant getting to the next moment. And I think that in that context, consent wasn't the primary focus, but I also like totally understand, and I appreciate the conversation around what is consent in this book and what is not, because I think that that's like something that we don't talk about enough, is the blurred lines between it all. And I think that throughout the book you'll see like a lot of different ways in which Kiara experiences sex, and whether you consider it consensual or not, I think there's something to learn from the way that she experiences it.
And I know that you worked with a consultant on the book who was a sex worker, because obviously that conversation is particularly fraught in the context of sex work. Absolutely. And the kind of conversations going on around that was particularly important to you to kind of portray accurately.
Yeah, it was very important to me that we had a sex worker read this book and provide feedback, because that was something that I knew that I couldn't do full justice to if I didn't have, you know, the notes from someone who had that lived experience. And I think sometimes that's really important in fiction, and particularly around, you know, logistics and all of the different forms of sex work. I wanted to make sure that it was as accurate as possible, but also like there are so many types of sex work and so many experiences within sex work that I knew that I needed it to also just be Kiara's experience.
Yeah. It's a beautiful book. It's so beautifully written, even when what it's conveying is often bleak and difficult. How did your experience as the Youth Poet Laureate in Oakland kind of feed into your writing?
I mean, I think that it gave me this idea of like rhythm and cadence as a central component to all writing. So I read a lot of my work out loud, and I also just like, I think that one of the most important things is, does it have a rhythm? Does it have its own way in which you can like feel it? And I think that poetry definitely emphasizes first like a felt sense. And I try to make sure that my work in my prose too has this translation to, you know, what we feel physically as well as emotionally and cognitively. So that definitely influences it. I also think that I just like love poetry and I love fiction, and I think getting to kind of blur that too and merge the two is really fun for me. And I think that especially when you have like a book, I think it's important that it's readable too. And so balancing readability with poetry was a challenge, but definitely like a fun one for me, because I think that I have always admired poets' novels, and getting to kind of do my own has been always a good time. But I think that especially with poetry, we all want to like be able to feel something when we read anything, and my experience with poetry, with performing in front of people, is like getting that direct feedback back. And you don't have that with a novel, but you do have the ability to like have more time, and time allows you to have a deeper like reader to have a deeper relationship with the work. And so being able to take what I've learned from having, you know, just a very short period of time to connect with a reader and then translate that kind of feel into a longer work has definitely helped.
I bet. And did that contribute to the intensity of your writing process as well? Because it sounds like it was quite a short, sort of all-consuming, immersive writing process. Is that right? How long how long were you writing the book?
I started writing the book, I think I wrote the first chapter about a month before I turned 17, about a month before I graduated high school. and then I wrote the rest of the first draft the summer before I left for college. So it was about 2.5 months for the whole thing, and then I revised over the next 6 months before selling.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Wow. And there are moments of huge joy and tenderness and love in the novel. How important was it to you to kind of balance out those moments of shade with the moments of light?
It's so important. I think that if we forget that people have a spectrum of experiences and emotions, then we remove humanity from each and every one of these characters. And so for me, it was really, really critical that I had just a wide spectrum of experiences for each character. And that doesn't all include just moments of joy. I think part of it was just like moments of mundaneness and moments of experiencing grief or sleep, or, you know, all of these things that I think if we don't have, we almost forget that a person exists outside of their pain.
Yeah, which is also comes back to that dehumanization. And there's also a really beautiful and very kind of subtly drawn love story in the book. How was it to write that as a first-time published novelist?
Yeah, I mean, I love a romance, but I also wanted this to be Kiara's story first, so I didn't want it to be the central component of the book. So I knew that from the beginning, was like, I wasn't sure if it was gonna be a romance at all, but I knew that even if it was going to turn out that way, it was not gonna be the primary plot in any way. So it was fun for me to have that kind of different plot going on, and it was also important for Kiara to have someone who didn't really want anything from her, and I think that's why this romance works.
Were there any elements of the book that did change dramatically over the process? Was there anything that kind of surprised you in the...
So many things changed. I originally had so many scenes that were like backstory and scenes between Marcus and Kiara that didn't end up making it into the book, mostly because I needed it to be a forward-moving plot, and I think that that's really important for readability, but I then had to balance making sure Marcus was still lovable and understandable, because he is such a difficult character. So many of us hate him at times throughout the reading experience, and I think that that's so fair, but we can't hate him without also loving him in some way. So a lot of it was like pulling from these extracts that I had written and then taken out and being able to form him into someone that we could have compassion for.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel a sense of kind of protectiveness over the characters now that they're out in the world and people's responses to them?
Yeah, a little bit, especially Marcus, I think, because I worked so hard to make sure that people could have compassion for him, and some people just still hate him. And I totally get it. I think that there are moments where I'm very mad at him too. But yeah, definitely him I'm a little more protective of. I think most people have just like gone in with a deep love for Kiara and Trevor, and I think it's almost impossible not to have. So I feel like they've been pretty protected throughout.
That's nice. How has it felt for the book to come out against the backdrop of a kind of ongoing national and international conversation around the Black Lives Matter movement and racial injustice and police brutality?
I mean, it's even more important. I remember I went to a lot of protests in 2015 during those uprisings, and then again in 2020, and I remember thinking at both of these, like, how little had changed over those 5 years, and particularly, I mean, these are movements founded by and organized by Black women attempting to center Black women, and there's the Say Her Name chant, which was founded by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it becomes like this chant during protests, right? And so whoever has the megaphone will say her name, and then you'll be told whose name you're about to say. And every time I was at these protests, it would start with Say Her Name, and then it would quickly shift to Say His Name, which I would just always think like that is entirely opposite of the point of why this was created in the first place. And I think that there's often this neglect and this shying away from recognizing Black women and Black girls as vulnerable people. And so I think it's even more important that we are able to have these conversations, and also that we recognize that police violence comes in many different forms. And I think it's hard for people, it's uncomfortable to recognize sexual violence as an iteration of police violence, because it recognizes that rape isn't about sex, it's about power, and when we talk about it in the context of people who have complete authority, we have to recognize that. And so I think that it's even more important that we include that in our definition of what even is police brutality.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that you mentioned being surprised by in your research, right? That it was the second most common form of police violence, was sexual violence, and yet, as you say, it just isn't something that we hear about. So one of the things the novel does so brilliantly is give voice to those experiences that you're talking about, the frustration of them not being recognised. And of course the book is also published against the even more recent backdrop of pretty terrifying setbacks in America in terms of reproductive justice. How do you feel about the current political landscape, and particularly the potential ramifications for women of colour?
I mean, it's so infuriating, and at the same time very much predictable, and there are so many Black women in particular that have been working through reproductive justice and policy and providing like support on the ground for decades, and I think that it's important that we recognize the disproportionate impact that the overturning of Roe v. Wade will have on women of color and Black women in particular, and that means that whatever support, whatever outcomes of policy that we're attempting to achieve mean that we have also a specific focus on what does that mean for Black women in particular, because it often has kind of a converse reaction than what we want it to. And I think that it's important that we recognize, also the historical precedent of controlling Black women's reproductive rights and bodies, and that continues to always be at the forefront of conversations around what do we do moving forward.
Absolutely, and the fact that it isn't always at the forefront of those conversations is kind of reflected in the book in Kiara's well-grounded reservations and suspicion of the kind of white women who sort of want to see themselves as her saviors, but in reality then kind of often end up worsening her situation. And that presumably also feels very poignant in light of everything that's going on at the moment, the number of white women who voted for Donald Trump and so on. So was that an important kind of element to thread through as
well? It was, and I think it's especially, we have Marcia, who is Kiara's lawyer, towards the last half of this book, and I think that I wanted to show someone who thinks they're saving Kiara, like a white savior, but she is the only one who thinks she's saving her, and it's not always out of a place of malice, but I think that if we watch Kiara, we know that like she doesn't really need someone else to be saving her, and she needs a system that works differently. And this one person who walks in trying to save her like can, and also gets it wrong over and over again. And I think that it's important that we recognize how, if this had ended differently, even then there would have been more focus on like what Marcia did than anything that Kiara did. And I think that it's important to think about the people that we praise in these kind of situations too.
And one of the things that you write about very eloquently in the book is the gentrification. You talk about people settling the land and calling it entrepreneurship. There's a brilliant passage where you write the pockets are roaming around Oakland looking for the next lot of us to scrape out from the city's insides. Growing up in the Bay Area, in the area that, of course, the book is based in, was that sense of kind of encroaching gentrification, these tech firms, kind of constant presence? Was that something you were aware of growing up?
Oh, yeah, because it was, I think, about 2012 that there was this, like, quick influx of wealth, and our housing market boomed, and I think it just got worse from there, and even worse 2017, and so my whole life there's been this like change, this rapid shift, and so many of the places that I loved growing up don't exist anymore, and so much of the city looks differently than it did when I was younger, and my parents also have been living in Oakland for decades and decades, and they have memories from the 80s, and that's an even different Oakland, and I think it's always really important that we, in a story about this city set in 2015, that is included in the entire book, and it's even our catalyst, really, where Kiara and her brother receive a rent increase notice that their rent is being doubled, and that's like very much a reality of this like mass displacement. And I wanted to start with what impact does that have on an individual level.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways the book is a kind of love letter to elements of Oakland. How has it felt living there now with the book coming out? Do you feel like you're kind of constantly in this world that you were writing in, and what's the local reaction been like to the book?
So I haven't been home since the book came out, so I'm not really sure how it'll be when I go back, but I've gotten so many messages from people in Oakland, and it has just meant the world, because I think it's even more of a compliment to have people who like know this city so intimately say like you captured it, and so I'm really grateful that I've gotten that response already. And I mean, it was really interesting for me too, because I wrote this book this summer before I left for college, and so it was kind of like also a goodbye in some strange way, a kind of capturing a tableau of the city before I left. And then I left and I moved to rural Massachusetts for maybe 3 or 4 months, and it was a huge culture shock for me. And then the pandemic hit, and I went back, and I, permanently moved back, and experiencing the city again, also in the wave of like new pandemic shifts, has been such an experience for me.
I bet, yeah. This is a really difficult question, I know, but we've talked about so many different issues, systemic issues, around gentrification, around racism, around police brutality and gender stereotyping and misogyny. There's a really poignant moment in the novel where Kiara wonders, she says, maybe this is how we get free. Do you have any sense of how we get free of all this, where we start?
I mean, I think it always starts with confrontation, that we first recognize, acknowledge, and confront the things that are already true, and particularly like shifting the blame away from individuals and towards, systems that create all of the conditions for each system to thrive, and recognize how they're all kind of interconnected. And I think that when we start confronting that, that's when we have to figure out, where do we go from here? And there's a lot of sacrifice that goes into change. And I think that is the most challenging thing for so many of us, is like recognizing that in order to have something different, we have to let go of what we know. And there's a lot of fear that goes into that. So I think that's like the next steps. But I also think that it's really challenging for a lot of people to even get there.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the ways that you evoke that so beautifully in the book and so cleverly is by referring to the police officers by their badge numbers rather than their names. And I think that partly kind of absorbs them into the system as kind of cogs in a machine. But of course it also achieves a kind of brilliant flipping of the narrative where it foregrounds Leila and it dehumanizes them. Was that a kind of deliberate choice?
Yes, it was, because we often see the opposite, where we hear the names of officers first, and it often puts all Black people in the background of everything, and decenters us. And so I wanted to flip the narrative on its head and switch it so like we know every Black character in this book's name, and we don't know any of the police officers' names until the very end, because that's not important. It's not the most important thing. They're not the central characters in the story.
Yeah, and even then only kind of quite briefly and sort of almost,
I don't remember their names, and I wrote it.
Your debut poetry collection will be published soon. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you have planned next?
Yeah, I can't say too much about it, but it's a poetry collection. It'll kind of explore what does it mean for Black girls to want and to dream and to desire. And I think it'll be a really cool combination of like spoken poetry and written poetry, and just all kinds of poetic explorations of the world.
Amazing. And am I allowed to ask you anything about a potential next novel, or is that strictly?
You can ask.
I don't want to get you in trouble here.
I can't say too much about it again, but I am working on another novel, and it's set in a very different place with very different characters, more of an ensemble feel, but some people you won't forget. Yeah.
Fabulous. Very exciting. I wanted to ask you about being such a young woman in this place, in this moment, this kind of experience that you're having. You've taken a sabbatical from college in order to launch the book. Do you feel a sense of kind of pressure around what happens next? It's an awful lot for you to be carrying.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always pressure when you stray from the path that many of us are given from a young age. So I definitely feel like uncertain, and I think that not knowing has been definitely something I've had to get used to, but I think it's kind of important too, that especially when we're young, that we like don't know everything, that we recognize it's okay to not know everything. So I'm not exactly sure, you know, when I'm going back to school, or if I'm going back to school, or where I'm going back to school, or anything like that. But I know that this has been like a once in a lifetime experience, and that we all have like a different path through life, and this has been mine.
Thank you. And what about for writers who are watching, particularly perhaps young writers, perhaps unpublished writers, perhaps writers who feel that they don't often see stories like theirs reflected back to them from the publishing industry? Do you have any words of advice? What would you say to those particularly girls who might be watching?
I mean, I think that you have to write for you first. I think that that's like the most important thing I ever did, was like not write for anyone else, not show anyone else my work until I felt sure about it, because I think your opinion is the most important thing. And writing like is something that we do for ourselves in the first place, or why are we doing it, right? And so for me, it's always been, you know, the most important thing is that I look at my work and I read my work and I say like there's something of value in this, and even when I feel insecure about it, that I can at least recognize that if I was reading it, especially if a younger version of me was reading it, I would be proud, and I would be just like so seen. I would feel so seen. So I think that that's the most important thing that we can do as writers, is make ourselves feel seen. And, you know, it's like Toni Morrison said, if you haven't read a book, write it. And I think that's kind of why I started writing this one. And I also think that just one of the other most important things that I ever learned was like being able to acknowledge and accept that your work might not also always be good, and it doesn't have to always be good, and most people's work is not good the first time it comes out, you know, and that revision is an art, and it is a skill, and it takes a while to learn it.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you, there's a moment in the book where Kiara says, when the cops first show up, she says, "Ain't it funny to be so scared of being saved?" Which how conscious were you of trying to explain to readers who might not have had this norm growing up, the norm of growing up in a world where police officers don't equal safety, and where you know that from a really young age?
I mean, I think that I wanted to allow her different reactions to the whole thing to come through at once. And I think that, you know, fear is something many of us learn from a young age. Like, I think most Black kids learn that you fear police, and for many very good reasons. And I think a lot of us get that talk from really early on. I know I did. And I remember, like, my dad would talk to me and my brother about his experiences with the police, and you know, this kind of talk I think a lot of kids get in different ways. And I remember also, like, thinking as I grew up, like, why didn't I get to talk about, like, when I was walking down the street and men called out to me? Like, why didn't I get a talk about, like, groping or being followed home? And I think part of what we also need to recognize in, like, Kiara's context is it's like this level of paranoia and fear that is both on a racial level and just from the amount of sexual harassment that also I think a lot of young women, especially women of color, experience from when they're girls. And so I wanted that also to be folded into what does it mean to fear police.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of compassion in your portrayal of so many of the different characters in the novel, especially characters who traditionally aren't necessarily treated with empathy or compassion. Particularly I'm thinking of Trevor's mother, for example. How conscious was that decision to try and really understand? There are a lot of characters in the novel who've made certain choices, including Kiara's own mother, and you really try to kind of get behind what leads to those choices in those places, and the fact that in many cases they aren't really choices at all.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that that's such a huge part of being able to humanize anyone, is recognizing like how they ended up where they are. And especially I think when I looked at the Black women in this book, and the Black mothers in this book, and because this book centers on like Black kids and what happens to them, but I think also then you need to look at their parents and what happened to them, and when the world doesn't provide you like basic care, it is really hard to continue to care for others. And I think that that's a lot of what happens to the mothers in this book, is that they have lived a life full of caring and full of holding everything, and after all of that, it is really hard to continue going on, especially when you have no moments to grieve or to experience rest or anything like that. And that is not their fault. And at the same time, it has a very real impact on their children. And so I wanted to be able to look at all of them as individual people who are living in a world that is not set up to support individual people.
Yeah, and it's a really searing portrait of intergenerational trauma, really, in a way, isn't it? That sense that it's being handed down.
Yeah, it is. And I think that that's often just not conscious, you know, and also not our choice. And I think that Kiara's mother wouldn't have chosen that for herself or her children. But at the same time, like, she was trying to find any way out. And I think that after, you know, the fatigue of decades of living through, you know, caring for your basic needs and then caring for everyone else's, and then trying to find purpose and hope in it all, it becomes really hard to be able to do what you want or love the people that you love in a way that fulfills them and you.
Yeah, and you manage to balance that with also writing this gorgeous, really compelling, beautiful, moving kind of maternal instinct in some ways that Kiara has for Trevor, for the 10-year-old son of her neighbour who kind of falls sort of to her care, really. He is just, can we talk about Trevor for a minute?
Yeah.
He's such a gorgeous character. He's kind of just bursts off the page. How was it shaping Trevor? Where did he come from? What kind of fed into that character?
I mean, I love kids, and I was working in preschools at the time that I wrote this book, and so I was surrounded by children and just like kind of taking in how they experience the world and their like ability to live in the present moment. I think it does something for all of us to get to experience childhood through a child's eyes. And I think for Kiara in particular, who wasn't really afforded the ability to have a childhood, she wants one, and she finds glimpses of it through Trevor, and at the same time she's trying to remother him, even though she's still a kid herself. And I think it becomes complicated as he is another person she has to care for, but also she loves him infinitely, and they both need something from each other, you know. Trevor needs someone to care for him, and Kiara needs to feel like she can be a kid again, and at the same time I think she believes she can save him the way that she wished she'd been cared for. She thinks she can care for him, but she doesn't have the resources to do that.
And it's yet another weight on her.
It's another weight.
And actually another means by which to kind of exploit and blackmail her later on when figures in authority take advantage of that relationship. The relationship between Kiara and her mother is another one that I thought was really interesting, and there's a very significant plot point involving her mother and her younger sister that you quite deliberately kind of sideline. It's such a huge thing, but it's kind of barely mentioned in the novel. What made you make that choice?
It's a hard thing for them to talk about, and I think that kind of silence runs through their world. Is like it's something that no one wants to acknowledge in that family, the hurt that they are still experiencing from that. And so I think that I wanted to show, you know, the way that the silence moves through, and we can feel that something is wrong, but we don't know what it is. And I think that that's kind of, you know, what it feels like to have your mother not acknowledge the harm that she has done. and to have this like silence run through their family and be adopted through by all of them, really.
And confronting her mother about that. It's one of the only times in the book when she's really able to kind of be quite sort of strong and kind of angry almost.
Yeah.
Does that feel like it's because it's on behalf of someone else, still that sense of fighting,
Absolutely.
but only ever for the other people around her, not for herself?
Yeah, and being able to, like, she's trying to rupture that pattern, but yeah, it's not entirely for her, and yet it is in some ways about her. And I think that them being able to recognize the way that they failed each other is all Kiara really wants, is some acknowledgement of her hurt. And I think that that's something that so many of us want, is to be acknowledged and seen. And I think that with what happens with her mother, it's one concrete way in which she can ask for that.
A lot of the book takes place in quite kind of technical settings, if you like, within the police department, in interview rooms, and then eventually at a grand jury trial. How was it as a writer to research that? Because there's quite a lot of kind of technical processes and language, and you know, who can be in which rooms at which time. Was that a lot? That must have been difficult to navigate.
Yeah, I did a lot of research. I like research, so I didn't mind it too much. But there's a lot of rules, and I had to kind of learn them all. And they're kind of always shifting depending on circumstance and county, and you know, all of these things that create variables that I had to really learn like the back of my hand in order to write into them. And then I had to remove some details of it because it doesn't always really matter to a story. And I think that's sometimes the challenge of research is, as the author, I needed to know it all, but the reader doesn't need to know everything about the proceedings, only enough to follow the story. But I had to learn a lot, and at the same time, like, Kiara's not, you know, memorizing every detail of how a grand jury works, and I didn't want it to get dragged down in those details.
And the other place that kind of comes to life so sharply, as if it really is as if you're there, is the Regal High, the apartment complex where Kiara lived. How was it building that kind of world? What did you draw on there?
Oh God, I don't even know where I got the like imagery of it. I think I learned that you can only like see people's faces in your dreams who you've actually seen in real life, and I think it's kind of like that, where I've probably seen an apartment complex that looks something like the Regal High does, but I couldn't tell you where. And High Street was really important for me to set it on. I grew up right up the street from High Street, and so I think that I wanted to have geography that I really understood so deeply that I could place myself there with no problem. And so that helped me with setting it right there on a street that I had walked so many times. And then from there, like, figuring out just the landscape of the apartment complex, it kind of just comes to me, and I think that that's partly because I see it as an image first. I kind of write cinematically in that way, where I see it and then I describe it, and I get my footing, and then I try to translate it onto a page so the reader can too.
Thank you. I know that we're coming to the end of our time, so I just want to ask you a final question, which is about what you hope that readers listening will take away from the book, what you most hope that the book will achieve, what it will mean to people.
I mean, I really hope that people love these characters, and that love, that acknowledgement of these characters, that empathy and compassion for them helps more people think about, you know, how we're all complicit in the harm of Black girls and Black women, and how we could do more to preserve people's childhoods and our own, and I hope that, you know, it really just expands our ideas of this world and of the people who make it up.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Any of you who haven't already purchased a copy of Nightcrawling with your ticket, I really urge you to get one from your preferred local book retailer. It is absolutely incredible. It's such a brilliant, brilliant story and a beautiful book. Thank you so much to Leila Mottley for joining me, and thank you to Fane for hosting this event. Thank you, Leila.
Thank you.